Imagine a mighty tree, its roots firmly planted in rich soil, drawing strength from the depths below. This is my metaphor for Indonesia's economy today. Robust and full of life. It's deeply rooted in stability. A young and dynamic workforce, a prime geographic location, and rich natural resources provide a firm foundation for sustained success. Today, we delve into the latest developments shaping Indonesia's economic landscape. I am waiting for the tree to have an apple fruit. Stay tuned and stay safe.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Indonesia's economic landscape.
Excellent.
And this is one I think you're really going to enjoy as economists.
Yeah.
You know, we've got the usual government reports and economic analyses to sort through.
Yeah.
But we're also pulling in some international news sources to really give you a sense of how Indonesia's economy is being viewed on the global stage.
Great.
And one of the first things that jumped out at me was how well Indonesia seems to be doing despite all the global headwinds out there.
Well, yeah, it is striking, right? I mean, while many emerging markets are facing some real challenges, Indonesia's economy is projected to keep growing at a pretty healthy clip.
Exactly.
In fact, Bank Indonesia is forecasting growth in the range of 4.7 to 5.5% for 2024.
Wow.
And then they even see that rising to 4.8 to 5.6% in 2025.
Okay.
And then even further to 4.9 to 5.7% in 2026.
Those are some seriously impressive numbers.
Yeah.
So what's the secret sauce here? What are they doing that others aren't?
Well, our sources point to a few key factors.
First off, Indonesia seems to have weathered the COVID-19 storm better than many.
Yeah, they definitely avoided a major crisis, and that quick rebound has really helped.
And that recovery's been helped along by some pretty solid macroeconomic policies.
Right. There's a real sense of coordination between the government's fiscal stimulus measures and Bank Indonesia's monetary policy.
Exactly. It seems like they're on the same page, which makes a big difference.
Huge.
But it's not just about reacting to crises. It's about actively transforming their economy for the long term.
And that's where things get really interesting. Our sources keep mentioning this push to improve the investment climate, develop much-needed infrastructure, and strategically pursue something they're calling the downstreaming of natural resources.
Yes, downstreaming. That's a really interesting concept, and I think it's worth unpacking a bit. Essentially, Indonesia wants to move beyond just exporting raw materials.
Correct.
They want to develop domestic industries that actually process those resources, add value, and create more jobs within their own borders.
So kind of like moving up the value chain. Exactly. It's a really ambitious strategy with massive potential, but it also requires significant investment and expertise.
Of course, which makes their efforts to attract foreign investment even more crucial.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing that stood out to me in the sources was the major emphasis on digitization.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like it's really reshaping how Indonesia's economy functions. I mean, the government is pushing hard for payment transaction digitization, and it's reaching everyone from big companies to everyday consumers.
And this is fascinating because it goes beyond just convenience. It has the potential to boost financial inclusion dramatically. Think about it. Millions of Indonesians could be brought into the formal economy.
Yeah, giving them access to financial services they never had before, that's a game changer.
Absolutely.
Now, all of this is happening against a backdrop of surprisingly low inflation. Our sources say the rate was just 1.55% in November 2024.
Wow, that's a huge drop from the 2.86% they saw in November 2023.
It is a pretty remarkable figure, especially considering the global inflationary pressures many economies are facing. It makes you wonder, how sustainable is this low inflation? Is it a window for bolder policy moves?
It's a good question, and something policymakers will be watching very closely.
Speaking of bold moves, we can't ignore the whole iPhone ban.
Oh, yeah, the missing iPhone. It's certainly making headlines.
It really is. And I think it provides some valuable insight into Indonesia's economic strategy. For those who haven't been following closely, the government banned the sale of the iPhone 16 because Apple failed to meet a 40% local manufacturing content requirement.
Right, and this isn't some new rule they sprung on Apple. It's been in place for a while.
It has.
But under President Prabowo, enforcement has definitely ramped up. It sends a clear signal that Indonesia isn't just content with being a consumer market anymore.
They want to be a manufacturing powerhouse.
Exactly, and they're using their market access as leverage.
And they're not afraid to play hardball, even with one of the biggest tech companies in the world. I mean, Apple offered $10 million initially to try and smooth things over.
Yeah, and then they upped it to $100 million.
But both offers were rejected.
Rejected. And what's so fascinating about this whole standoff is that it goes way beyond just the iPhone.
Right. It reveals this bigger ambition
Yeah.
Indonesia has to become a major player in global tech manufacturing.
They're betting that by pushing giants like Apple to build factories there and really invest in Indonesia, that it will jumpstart their own high-tech ecosystem.
Now, the latest is that Apple might be considering a $1 billion manufacturing plant to meet those requirements.
Wow.
I mean, it's a huge investment, but it does make you wonder, is this a smart move by Indonesia? Are they attracting investment and boosting their tech industry? Or is this a risky gamble that could backfire and scare off other potential investors?
It's a tough question. It's a high-stakes game for sure.
It is. And the outcome will have implications not just for Indonesia's tech sector, but for their overall economic strategy.
For sure.
Now, this desire for more control over their economic future extends beyond tech.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting recent developments is President Prabowo's announcement of a 6.5% minimum wage increase for 2025.
That's a bold move, especially when you compare it to the 3.5% average increase they had in 2024.
Right. It signals this clear commitment to supporting workers and boosting domestic consumption.
It does, but it also raises some important questions, like how will businesses absorb this increased cost?
Yeah. Will it lead to inflationary pressures that wipe out any wage gains?
Yeah.
I mean, the potential ripple effects are significant.
For sure. We need to think about the impact on businesses on overall inflation and ultimately whether it leads to sustainable economic growth that benefits everyone, not just those getting the higher wages. It's a complex picture.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now let's talk energy, because Indonesia seems to be juggling a lot of competing priorities in this sector.
Absolutely. I mean, they've got these vast coal reserves, and they've traditionally relied heavily on that resource to fuel their economy.
Right.
But at the same time, they've made these international commitments to reduce emissions and transition to cleaner energy sources. It's a classic dilemma.
It is, balancing those short-term economic realities with long-term sustainability goals. And our sources reveal some mixed messages coming from the government on this.
Yeah.
I mean, we see some officials emphasizing the need to keep using coal to meet domestic energy demands.
Right, because they need to keep the lights on.
Exactly. But then President Prabowo is out there reiterating his commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2050.
Mm-hmm.
So it begs the question, can they really have it both ways? Can Indonesia reconcile its dependence on coal with those ambitious climate goals?
Or will they have to make some tough choices? It's a question a lot of countries are wrestling with.
They are. This tension between economic pragmatism and environmental responsibility, it's a key theme that keeps popping up in our sources.
And it's a theme that's made even more complex by the constantly shifting global energy landscape.
It's exactly. Energy security is becoming a top priority for governments all over the world, and Indonesia is no exception.
No, they are very aware of potential disruptions to global energy supplies.
And they're actively looking for ways to safeguard their own energy future in this increasingly unpredictable world. It's a reminder that economics and geopolitics are deeply intertwined.
They are.
And the decisions Indonesia makes today will have consequences for their economy, their position in the region and beyond.
Right. It's this complex web of interconnected factors, and understanding those connections is crucial if you're trying to make sense of where Indonesia's economy is headed.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of connections, let's talk about President Prabowo's recent international tour, which led to a bunch of investment commitments.
Yeah, it seems like he was quite successful in attracting capital from around the world, particularly from China.
His trip brought in a whopping $18.5 billion in investment commitments, with China playing a major role. But this influx of Chinese investment comes with its own set of complexities and potential challenges.
It does. And it's not just about the money during his visit to China. They issued a joint statement acknowledging overlapping claims in the South China Sea.
Right.
And that seemingly small detail has caused quite a stir-raising questions about potential concessions to China.
And the long-term implications for Indonesia's sovereignty.
Right, because while Indonesia has generally tried to stay neutral in those South China Sea disputes, this joint statement has fueled speculation about a potential shift in their foreign policy.
Yeah, some analysts see it as a pragmatic way to secure economic benefits, while others are worried about Indonesia's strategic autonomy.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
It is.
Yeah.
They want that Chinese investment, but they don't want to get caught in the middle of a superpower rivalry.
Exactly.
It's a dynamic that will continue to play out, and it's something we as economists need to keep an eye on.
We do.
Because these economic decisions are often influenced by political calculations and vice versa. How Indonesia manages those ties with China will have a huge impact on their economic trajectory. Now, China's not the only country looking to strengthen economic ties with Indonesia. President Prabowo also finalized a new trade agreement with Canada.
He did.
Aiming to boost Indonesian exports in sectors like textiles, processed food, and palm oil. It shows that they're pursuing a multi-pronged strategy.
They are trying to diversify their partnerships and secure those favorable trade deals and access to new markets. It's a smart approach in today's uncertain global economy.
It is. And it reminds us that we can't just view Indonesia's economic strategy through a single lens. They're balancing domestic priorities with international pressure's short-term needs with long-term ambitions.
It's a dynamic situation for sure, full of potential pitfalls and opportunities. To really understand what's happening, we need to look beyond the headlines and dig into the details of their policy choices, their partnerships, and the internal forces that are shaping their economic future.
That's what we're here for.
Exactly. It really is fascinating when you start to peel back the layers. We often get caught up in the big picture stuff like GDP growth and investment deals, but the real measure of success is how those things translate into tangible benefits for the people living in Indonesia.
Absolutely. And that's where demographics come into play. One of our sources dives into this really interesting analysis of how Indonesia's demographic profile can be both a blessing and a curse for their economic development. It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. On the one hand, you've got this large and growing population, which means a potentially huge workforce and a strong consumer market. This is where the whole demographic dividend argument comes from: more people working and spending, which should lead to faster economic growth.
Right. But as our source points out, it's not just about the quantity of people, it's also about the quality.
Right.
Their health, their education, their skills, all of that plays a huge role in determining whether this demographic potential is actually realized or if it becomes a burden.
Exactly. Yeah. If you have a large portion of the population who are chronically ill, unemployed, or lacking those essential skills, then they become a drag on the economy instead of a driver of growth.
Yeah.
Instead of contributing, they require support, which can lead to what some economists call a demographic burden.
Right. So instead of reaping the benefits of that demographic dividend, the government ends up spending more on social aid programs and healthcare, which leaves less room for investment in things like education infrastructure initiatives that really drive long-term growth. It's a tough cycle to break.
It is, and that's why this source really emphasizes the need for Indonesia to invest in high-quality, affordable education and healthcare. It's not just a matter of social responsibility, it's an economic imperative if they want to unlock that demographic dividend.
Yeah, they need to equip their workforce with the skills and the health to really thrive and contribute. And it's not just about educating the next generation. There's also this challenge of helping workers transition from the informal sector to the formal sector.
Oh, absolutely, because a large informal sector, while it might provide livelihoods for many, can actually hold back economic development.
Right, because often the informal sector operates outside the reach of regulations and taxation, so the government loses out on revenue and workers miss out on important protections.
Yeah.
They don't get benefits like pensions, health insurance, unemployment support.
Exactly.
So encouraging that shift to formal employment is not just about boosting government coffers, it's about creating a more stable and sustainable foundation for everyone.
For sure. And speaking of improving lives, did you see President Prabowo's order to reduce domestic airfares by 10% for the Christmas and New Year holidays?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting. It's a temporary measure, but I think it reflects a broader concern about the affordability of air travel within Indonesia. Making transportation more accessible, especially for people traveling to see family during the holidays, could really boost domestic tourism and regional economic activity.
Absolutely, and it also shows a certain level of sensitivity to the needs of citizens, especially during times of economic uncertainty. Even if it's a symbolic gesture, it could go a long way in building trust.
Definitely. Now, circling back to the energy sector for a moment, we see another example of Indonesia trying to balance those economic realities with environmental ambitions. We talked about the mixed messages coming from the government on their energy transition, and one of our sources provides even more context on the challenges they face in moving away from coal.
Right. Their energy minister has been pretty vocal about putting domestic interests first when it comes to energy policy. His argument is that as long as renewable energy is still expensive and the Indonesian economy isn't strong enough to handle the costs of a rapid transition, they'll need to keep relying on their coal reserves.
So even though President Prabowo might be pushing for a faster shift to net zero, others in his administration are taking a more pragmatic approach, acknowledging those economic realities.
Exactly. It's a tension we're seeing in a lot of countries right now. How do you balance the ideal of a clean energy future with the need for economic growth and energy security in the present?
Especially when you have this readily available and affordable source of energy like coal. It's a tough dilemma.
Yeah.
And PLN, the state-owned electricity company, has been very clear about their position.
Oh, yeah.
They've said that any plans to retire coal-fired power plants early have to be cost neutral.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to bear the financial burden of transitioning to renewables. So the question becomes, is that even feasible? Can Indonesia meet its climate goals without making some difficult choices and maybe even taking on some short-term costs?
It's a huge question, and not just for Indonesia. It's something the whole world is grappling with.
Absolutely. And it's all happening against this backdrop of constant change in global energy markets.
Right. You've got geopolitical events, technological advancements, shifting demand patterns. It makes it really hard to predict what the future of energy will look like.
And one of our sources pointed out how this uncertainty is making energy resilience a top priority for the Indonesian government.
Yeah.
They know how vulnerable global energy supplies can be, whether it's due to conflict, natural disasters, or political maneuvering, and they're trying to figure out how to ensure their own energy security in this unpredictable landscape.
For sure.
It's a reminder that these economic decisions, especially when it comes to energy, are rarely made in a vacuum.
Right.
There's this whole web of domestic and international factors at play, and you have to consider all of them.
You do. Now, speaking of international factors, I think it's worth mentioning President Prabowo's trips to the UK and the UAE.
Yeah, his visit to China got a lot of attention, but these other trips were also important for strengthening relationships and securing those economic benefits.
For sure. In the UK, he announced this new strategic partnership focusing on defense industrial cooperation.
Right, specifically the Maraputa General Purpose Frigate Program.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. I mean, this program involves jointly developing and building advanced frigates for the Indonesian Navy. It shows a growing level of trust and shared interests.
It does. And then in the UAE, Prabowo secured another $8.5 billion in private investment commitments, including a big project by BP to develop a gas field and a carbon capture project in Papua.
Interesting.
It is right,
Yeah.
especially given our conversation about their energy transition.
It is. It's like a case study in how they're trying to navigate this complex energy future. On the one hand, they're developing new gas resources, which some might see as going against their climate goals.
Right.
But on the other hand, they're incorporating this carbon capture technology, trying to mitigate the environmental impact. It's a nuanced approach.
It is. It suggests they're not just picking between fossil fuels and renewables. They're looking at a whole range of options, trying to figure out how to use their existing resources while also taking steps toward a more sustainable future.
It's a pragmatic approach, recognizing that this energy transition isn't a simple flip of a switch.
It isn't. Now let's bring it back to the domestic economy for a moment and talk about something that's sure to spark some debate, the recent VAT increase.
Ah, yes, the VAT increase. There have been concerns about the impact on consumer spending, especially with the current economic climate. But it's important to remember that President Prabowo only approved a 12% VAT rate on luxury items.
That's a key point. The general public is still paying the 11% rate on most goods and services. The government has been very specific about what falls under this new higher bracket. We're talking high-end apartments, luxury homes, expensive cars, those kinds of things.
Right. It's a targeted measure aimed at those who can afford to contribute a bit more. And it's designed to generate extra revenue without hurting ordinary Indonesians.
Yeah, essential goods, healthcare, education, government services, those are all unaffected.
So we'll have to see how this selective VAT hike plays out, how it impacts consumption and tax revenue.
Definitely something to watch. And while we're on the topic of economic indicators, we can't ignore the recent performance of the Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI. It gives us a good sense of the health of the manufacturing sector.
Right. And the news from Indonesia isn't great. Their manufacturing PMI has been contracting for 5 months in a row.
Yeah, it did edge up slightly to 49.6 in November,
Mm-hmm.
but that's still below the 50-point threshold, so it's still contracting.
Yeah, and this prolonged contraction raises some red flags about the overall health of the manufacturing sector and whether it can contribute to economic growth.
Especially when you compare Indonesia to other ASEAN countries, many of which are actually seeing manufacturing expansion. The Philippines and Thailand, for example, have had significant improvements in their PMI readings.
Right, so it makes you wonder, is Indonesia losing its competitive edge?
It's a valid concern. Declining new orders and cutbacks in hiring those are signs of weak demand both domestically and internationally. It suggests that Indonesia needs to address some underlying structural issues if they want to remain a manufacturing hub.
They do.
It brings us back to the need for those ongoing structural reforms, which we've talked about quite a bit. Improving the business environment, attracting the right kind of foreign investment, boosting productivity, fostering innovation. All of those are critical for revitalizing their manufacturing sector.
They are.
And speaking of attracting the right kind of investment, let's circle back to Apple for a moment. It's a good case study in how Indonesia is trying to attract high-tech manufacturing.
It is.
But one of our sources offers this really interesting critique of their approach, arguing that it might actually backfire in the long run.
Yeah.
They argue that simply forcing companies to assemble products locally without creating a supportive ecosystem for actual manufacturing could lead to superficial compliance.
Right.
Companies might just do the bare minimum to meet those local content requirements without really putting down roots or contributing to meaningful industrial growth.
Right? It's like they're putting the cart before the horse. They're demanding investment, but they're not necessarily providing the incentives, the skilled workforce, or the infrastructure to make Indonesia a truly attractive destination for high-tech manufacturing.
And they contrast Indonesia's approach with Vietnam's, which has been really successful in attracting those high-tech investments, especially from Apple suppliers.
Yeah.
Vietnam has become a key player in global supply chains.
Yeah.
And they've done it by focusing on creating a genuinely favorable business environment. They've invested in world-class infrastructure, they've got clear regulations, and they've streamlined those bureaucratic processes.
And they've offered incentives to attract foreign companies.
Exactly. And importantly, they've really focused on fostering technology transfer, encouraging those foreign companies to share their knowledge and expertise with local businesses and institutions. It's a more holistic approach, recognizing that attracting investment and building a thriving high-tech sector requires more than just market size or regulatory pressure. It's about creating a win-win where both the country and the companies investing benefit.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, it's clear that Indonesia has some big choices to make. Do they keep relying on their natural resources and low-cost labor? Or do they make the investments necessary to move up the value chain and become a real high-tech powerhouse?
It's a big question. The path they choose will have a huge impact on their economic future. It's fascinating to watch it all unfold.
It's amazing how every decision Indonesia makes seems to have these ripple effects, across different sectors and even internationally. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does. You can't analyze an economy in a vacuum, especially when you factor in the political landscape. And Indonesia is going through some pretty significant political transitions right now.
Yes, exactly. And President Prabowo's overseas trips, especially that visit to China, have generated a lot of discussion, and not all of it's been positive.
Oh, yeah.
One of our sources actually compiled some of the reactions to these diplomatic efforts, and I was particularly struck by the critique from The Economist. They weren't exactly singing Prabowo's praises, were they?
No. The Economist is known for its pretty blunt assessments, and they certainly didn't hold back here.
They didn't. Their main concerns seemed to be about the potential concessions Prabowo might have made to China and what that could mean for Indonesia's long-standing policy of non-alignment.
Yeah, they seem to be reading between the lines of those joint development agreements in the South China Sea, seeing them as a sign that Prabowo might be tilting towards China.
Yeah, potentially at the expense of Indonesia's more balanced approach to international relations.
Right. But it's important to remember that geopolitics is rarely black and white. I mean, other analysts see these agreements as a way for Indonesia to manage those tensions in the region and maybe even open doors for cooperation with China in other areas like trade or infrastructure development.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act, no doubt. They want the Chinese investment, they want to benefit from their economic power, but they also don't want to give up their sovereignty or get caught in the middle of a superpower rivalry.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And it's something we need to keep in mind as we analyze their economic decisions, because those decisions are often intertwined with these political calculations.
They are. How Indonesia manages these ties with China will have a significant impact on their overall trajectory.
No doubt. Now, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about education, because one of our sources highlighted some interesting developments in the government's efforts to improve education quality, specifically for teachers.
Yeah, President Prabowo made a splash with his announcement of a pretty substantial pay raise for teachers, really emphasizing how vital they are to the future of Indonesia.
It was a popular move, signaling this commitment to investing in human capital. But our source also points out that there's a healthy dose of skepticism from teacher associations.
Oh, yeah.
They're wondering if this pay raise is really new money or if it's just a repackaging of existing benefits that were already part of the teacher certification program.
Yeah, it's understandable that they're cautious. They've been promised improvements before that haven't always panned out.
Right. But it seems like Prabowo's plan goes beyond just a salary increase.
It does. He's also proposing this professional allowance for teachers who aren't civil servants, which is a significant chunk of the workforce.
And there's talk of skill improvement programs and even aid to help teachers get their bachelor's degrees.
It's a comprehensive approach, at least on paper. The key will be implementation, making sure these initiatives actually translate into real improvements for teachers.
Yeah, if they can pull it off, it could really boost the quality of education, which is so fundamental to their long-term economic development.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of essential institutions, we can't wrap up without mentioning the Corruption Eradication Commission, the KPK. They've been instrumental in the fight against corruption, but their authority has been a source of debate.
It has, and one of our sources highlighted this recent ruling by the Constitutional Court that actually expands the KPK's power to investigate corruption cases within the military.
That's significant.
It is. The military has traditionally had a degree of immunity from this kind of scrutiny, so this ruling could really open up a new front in the fight against corruption.
Yeah, it could lead to more transparency, more accountability within a very powerful institution. It's a positive step towards strengthening the rule of law and creating a more level playing field.
And it sends a message that the government is serious about tackling corruption no matter where it exists, which could have big implications for the investment climate and overall economic development.
Huge implications. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Indonesia's economy, I think the main takeaway is that this is a country at a crossroads. They're making big moves, trying to attract investment, stimulate growth, and transition to a more sustainable future.
But those moves come with risks and challenges both at home and on the global stage.
They do. And the decisions they make now will shape their economic trajectory, their political standing, and ultimately their ability to build a better future for their people.
It's a complex and dynamic situation, and as economists, it's fascinating to watch it all unfold. We hope you've enjoyed our deep dive, and maybe we've even sparked some new questions for you to ponder. Until next time, keep exploring, and thanks for listening.